Good evening and welcome to another edition of Tok Piksa. In the studio tonight, we are speaking to the man responsible for all things to do with development planning in the country. It's a big job and one that requires vision, not just for the next 2 years, but for the next 5 to 10 years and sometimes beyond that. Minister for National Planning and member for Alotau, Charles Abel, welcome to the program and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Neville, and thanks to EMTV for having me on Tok Piksa.
Planning is a big job. What are your views of planning in PNG today, and what more do we have to do?
Well, planning, of course, is very, very important, but one cannot continue to plan endlessly. But naturally, being the Department of National Planning and Monitoring and the Minister responsible, it was my role to come in and just to ensure quickly that the plans were appropriate and strategic. Look at things like our Constitution, obviously, and Vision 2050, and the Medium-Term Development Plan, which is the 5-year plan that expired in 2015. And given the current circumstances, because plans need to be reviewed, just to ensure that those plans were correct in the first instance, before getting on with the perhaps the more important aspects of the development process, and that is the implementation of those plans, and of course the monitoring and evaluation against those plans, which is the other important role planning plays. That has resulted in a document that we talk about a lot, and that is the STARS document, the National Strategy for Responsible Sustainable Development, because I felt to a degree, one, the plans were not sufficiently strategic, given changes in the world like climate change and the new sort of paradigm shift happening in the world at the moment around development, and reviewing this concept of endless growth and of course sustainability, and the element we've introduced, which is responsibility in terms of development, to making sure these are sufficiently captured in our plans. They are a fundamental aspect of our Constitution, actually. And one of the things that we've been saying is that despite saying many of these good things, in actual fact, the way we've been behaving is quite contrary to those principles. And we wanted somehow to get these principles captured and linked in the cascading plans, so your overarching Vision 2050, your medium-term development plan, through STARS to the annual budget. There's a sufficient linkage there, which ultimately we hope will come in the form of a planning act. So that whilst you don't necessarily legislate exact plans, you legislate a framework and underlying principles and provide a link to the annual budget such that those plans are actually funded in a systematic manner. You don't just have 5-year plans which are then ignored, perhaps, potentially in the development of your annual budgets. Plans must be funded, and that funding must be linked to the plans. That is the process that we've commenced. And again, I don't want to bore people too much with talking about plans, but as the Planning Minister, we've tried to create that linkage, starting with the STARS, the new Medium-Term Development Plan, which expires in 2017. The reason for that being we also wanted to align the plans with the political cycle, underlying principles converted into 5-year action plans, and linked to the annual budgets through a planning act. So the planning act is currently with the DJAG, Department of Justice and Attorney General, and the State Solicitor, and I'm hoping to bring that to Parliament. So just in a nutshell, what we have principles, overarching principles which are in the Constitution, but we're not activating those principles in our behaviours. And the other element of that is the PNG EMEA campaign that we've had. So we're trying to encourage Papua New Guineans to actually live those principles as well. They're not just development principles that the government is putting through programs of action in the budget and so on, but we want Papua New Guineans to think deeply, especially after our 40 years of independence, about where we are going and who we are, and how, as Papua New Guineans, we should be behaving. And many of the things that we see constantly in our society, symptoms of development issues, but they're behaviours that we feel are not Papua New Guinean behaviours. And if we're going to develop and be the Papua New Guinea that we all envision, we need to start with ourselves and our individual behaviours. You can have all the plans in the world, all the budgets in the world, but if we're not actively living the principles in the Constitution, or in the STARS strategy, responsible development, ultimately we'll continue to have these issues and poverty and violence and corruption, because it comes down to behavioral principles and morals and living by standards. It's not good enough just to say we're Christians. You know, it's not good enough to say we're responsible people. We've got to live those principles. And that's what the PNG EMEA aspect of the campaign, which is also a part of this START strategy.
Minister, the implementation and execution of plans is important, but these plans come from somewhere. And we've heard so much about the critical activity matrix, something that government has. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, Neville, the critical activity matrix is a tool of government. So once you've got the plans right, you need to then move into an execution phase. And it's an attempt to capture 15 critical actionable programs of government. And actually included in that critical activity matrix and those 15 priorities is getting the plans right. Then number 2 is getting the financing to finance those plans. Number 3 is the implementation process. And for example, amendments to the Public Finance Management Act, the introduction of the district development authorities, the funding and resourcing of lower levels of government, the payment bringing onto the payroll of the councillors and village court magistrates are examples of addressing implementation issues. And then the specifics under education, health, infrastructure, law and order, public service reform, agriculture, tourism, SOE reform, and then the Sovereign Wealth Fund and the LNG project, getting that across the line. So we've tried to just capture the activities of government into 15 critical elements that the government then can focus on, rather than trying to perhaps do everything at once in an ad hoc manner. And that's what the critical activity matrix is, and it's a reporting tool against the identified priorities of government that have come from the plans and that have also come from the Alotau Accord, which was the coalition established priorities of this government.
And how often does the government get an update on this matrix?
It's a quarterly. Planning produces a quarterly report. So you will have seen in Parliament, I think I've presented twice. The critical activity matrix is also captured in the National Planning Act or bill that we are proposing to bring. And what happens is that on an annual basis as well, there's a series of documents that get tabled with the annual budgets, so that we have a forward-looking budget, which is the proposed expenditure, but you also have some historical reports against the MTDP and the previous budgets. And these reports, according to the M&E framework in the Planning Act, compels the Department of Planning to table those reports as part of the budget process. So you have a PIP report that comes in, and then you have the pocketbook, which is, relates back to the MTDP, reports on the outcomes of the MTDP, and then you have this critical activity matrix report as well. So there's a series of reports that produces information. And these are coming from the M&E, monitoring evaluation aspect of it, which is part of what planning is also working on. And this is where things like the national ID and the NSO reforms come as well.
Now, the National ID project, where is it now? There is an outrolling of officers out to the centers, and there are also mobile units going around registering people. How important is it for everyone to get registered?
Yeah, Neville, it's important that people, first of all, understand what that project is about. And I mentioned investing into the M&E side of government. Government, of course, is conducting record budgets now, and that's deliberate. We've gone out to deliberately borrow to once and for all invest in the fundamentals of education, health and infrastructure. But we must also take the time to invest into the statistics and the reporting element of government, so that we can properly guide our development activities. The NID project, National ID under the Civil Registry Office, is meant to provide an information generating platform that is branches down into the provinces and even the districts, feeding back into a central database that is biometrically based. That means it's linked to particular human beings biometrically through your fingerprints, and it is generating a database with a range of information and a range of applications. And we've done a lot of work on this. 7 branches are now established, and by June we hope to have all the provincial fixed offices up and running. Of course, NID House is built, the legislation has been put in place, the financing has been put in place, the contractor Huawei is there, the software is established. There's a mobile registration part of it as well. That's where we've been experiencing difficulties. Okay. And we were meant to pilot the 2 areas, Yalibupangia and the NCD, through utilizing the National Statistics Office. We've had issues with that, and so that aspect of the program has had to be reviewed. So we'll be coming up with some, through the media, some announcements on how that is being changed to improve that particular process. But our intention at this stage is by the end of this year, of course, to have as many Papua New Guineans registered as possible. We have about 200,000 so far. But the intention is to have the whole of NCD registered before the end of this year, and through our branch network and some of the other activities like the public service registration process, to have as many other Papua New Guineans as possible registered as well. But when it comes to banking applications and particularly land registration, for example, and getting under the new Land Registration and Land Groups Incorporation Act, you have to get a new birth certificate, and incorporated land groups have to be re-registered, and you need that birth certificate. It's making this process easier because it's more accessible to get your birth certificates now down in the province, and it's helping to eliminate fraud because you have to physically be attached through this biometric system. It will help to eliminate the situation where there's been mass registration of birth certificates here in Port Moresby, with the bulk of the people at home not really knowing what is happening. The same applies to voting. It will because of this biometric ID, you have to be, you can only be one particular person with one particular name, and then you have access to only one particular vote, for example. So e-passports, biometrically based, they need that sort of biometric system because of terrorism and because of the need for and the concerns around identity fraud, provides that sort of application. So apart from general statistics about the population, where they're living, their movements, the demographic, age, and disability, and pensioners, apart from that general information that will help us with health services and education and so on, other agencies of government can tap into this database to draw information that at the moment everybody's collecting all over the place. One consistent and accurate database, and provides information to the Electoral Commission, information to the Health Department, the Education Department, Customs and Migration. Fingerprints can be used for the police in tracking criminals, and then of course banking and such applications. There's a wide applicability. Another example is to help clean up the government payroll. You have to demonstrate you've got an ID card, that you're one person, one pay policy, is another application that we will also be using this for. So we've had some challenges with the program, but the government remains committed to it.
How soon would the NID project be able to be accessible to other agencies like the Electoral Commission?
Well, I would say it is accessible now if they come and help develop the protocols in terms of what part of the information they want to access. We already have a database of some 200,000 Papua New Guineans that agencies of government can begin to utilize. Obviously, they want the whole population perhaps before they feel comfortable to utilize it. But an example is the Electoral Commission. We can use it partially in areas that are fully covered. The problem is at the moment the database is scattered in terms of information around the country. I know that people are coming into the branches and queuing up to register, and it's going to take time to get everyone up and on board. But information, the database is already there and under a very modern and protected information system in the NID House with a backup system at Telekom Rumana. And there is nothing stopping government agencies from coming and beginning to engage with the civil registry to start to draw on that information.
Now, there is a project called the Land and Affordable Housing Program. How is that coming along?
Yes, actually, planning's role is not necessarily in land and housing, although I have responsibility for the Office of Urbanisation. But it's actually because the Cabinet established an Affordable Land and Housing Ministerial Committee to look into the process, and by virtue of my chairmanship of that committee, we, with all the stakeholders, are trying to coordinate and address some of the issues around affordable housing, because it's multi-stakeholder, it's multi-departmental. So planning's role is to try and coordinate this process to make housing more accessible to the ordinary citizen. And you and I know that the ordinary person, the ordinary Papua New Guinean, simply cannot afford a reasonable quality house. And there are various issues for that. So the committee is trying to address those. The primary one is access to land. Land is simply, it's locked away, it's too expensive, it's hard to get a title, it's hard to deal with the lands department. So we have deliberately gone out and said, identified parcels of land that already belong to the government and brought them in and established a trust where this land can go in there and be held for the purposes of affordable housing. The Gerahu 3B project, for example, has been subdivided into 1,581 blocks. It is intended under this policy that those blocks will be given free to qualifying Papua New Guineans. Now, what are qualifying Papua New Guineans? Obviously, you've got to be a Papua New Guinean, you've got to be a first home buyer, not a third or fourth home buyer. And you have to have been screened by a participating bank in terms of the financing, or you already have your own financing. So this comes to the next question, which is the availability of financing. So the government has placed 200 million kina at BSP Bank for the purposes of lending to ordinary Papua New Guineans for homes with repayments over 40 years and at 4% interest. So with the Gerahu 3B project, we have allocated quotas to departments and to private agencies for that land, but those particular individuals have to apply for the financing, that financing we've provided at BSP Bank. BSP says yes, they meet all the qualifying requirements, except of course they don't have titled land. When they meet those qualifications, they will be then entitled to a free block of land, which will be issued from the land trust, which is now holding the land, it'll be a raffle process, unfortunately or fortunately, to remove any sort of hint of any sort of foul play. You'll get that title, you'll be able to access that cheaper finance, and then we have a whole range of participating private sector companies that have brought in their plans that we have said we want to keep the price below 400,000, and we want a price of even around 170,000 to construct a reasonable 2-3 bedroom house, which the particular successful applicant can choose his own plan from that particular company. And we will support them for the building board process and so on, help liaising with BSP Bank if necessary. All of a sudden you have ordinary Papua New Guineans have a free and titled block of land. They've got access to long-term and affordable financing, and they have options as to construction methods that are within their price range. And so we're piloting this program with those principles in mind to test it, and we are attempting to bring other government land into the land trust so that around the country we can apply the same principles. And the idea is to make housing, reasonable housing, accessible and affordable to ordinary Papua New Guineans. And this is what we are determined that the Gerahu 3B project will be. People for the first time will be able to get access to titled land and affordable financing and affordable construction plan and style.
Okay. And this process has already begun? You've had applicants for this program?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have already a long list of qualifying applicants from the BSP Bank. We've invited other banks to participate, but of course BSP is where the concessional funding has been placed. So we are going through the process. The trust has been established. At the next land board sitting, the land will be allocated into that trust. We've had to pay for the gazettal of the 1,581 titles. That trust is, the trustees are the relevant agency secretaries and heads. Justice and lands and the planning and finance are all in there. And their job is then through the secretariat, which is the urbanization office, is to then go through this process of allocating the land that I've just described, qualifying, low, medium and higher cost. There's different segments depending on the type of job that you have, for example, what you can afford. There will be this supervised raffle system for qualifying citizens to go in, and you'll be allocated your block of land. Your financing will be ready to go. You would have done some work already in choosing your type of house, and you can immediately draw that loan and begin construction of your house. We have provided funding to Eda Ranu, to PNG Power, and to NCDC to get the infrastructure work going down there. We are concerned, this is Gerahu 3B, about some of the squatting that's going on. So I'm encouraging the Office of Urbanisation to make sure that there's some sort of activity happening down there. We have invited construction companies to go down and build models of the houses that people can look at to help them choose, but to also begin to put a presence on site to demonstrate to people that this is government land under a government program. So we're well and truly into it. We are just moving as fast as we can to have those have that land protected so it doesn't get used for other purposes, and to have it allocated to individual Papua New Guineans, because that is the main impediment in the process, is that you don't have land. That's the main problem why you can't build your house. You can't go to the bank because you don't have title land. So to me, that is the fundamental impediment, stopping ordinary Papua New Guineans from having access. We have our district housing program as well, don't forget. The public institutional housing program, where the government has given money to districts to build public servant housing as well. So many of us, members of parliament, are already building district headquarters and public servant housing and police housing down in the district, with the cooperation through the policy of the governors as well. So there's been an allocation of housing. We've asked DSIP and PSIP funding to come in and complement that as well. And we sort of stated the goal of building 40,000 houses in this term. So you've got the private sector initiative I've just described, and you've got the public housing initiative as well that the government is also funding.
Minister, looking ahead at future developments for Papua New Guinea, if we could take Port Moresby, for example, we've got sewage problems happening, we've got traffic congestion happening everywhere. How can all government agencies responsible for provinces, for urban centres, work together of one central system to cater not just for today, but future developments?
Yeah, thank you, Neville. First of all, in terms of Port Moresby, you know, it's apparent and obvious that huge amounts of money have been invested in the Port Moresby infrastructure, and roads being the primary example, of course, and then other capacity like government institutional buildings and so on. But don't forget, we've also invested heavily in power generation, in particular recently to get, I think it's 40 megawatts of power to come into the system from the gas-fired plant, but also investing into a narrow brown hydro project and upgrading the Rona system as well as upgrading the reticulation system. There is also the long outstanding Port Moresby sewerage project with the assistance of the Japanese government that we have accelerated. That had to be reviewed because the plans were insufficient for the growth of the city. So there is due attention being given to the infrastructure of Port Moresby. You talk about traffic, look at the money we've spent on the roads in Port Moresby, which people can complain about, but it is preparing Port Moresby as our capital city for the future. The work that's gone into the hospital at Port Moresby General Hospital, the University of Papua New Guinea investment that is happening there. So we are investing in those things and preparing. But coming back to the planning process and the urbanisation process, within the Planning Act is a national service delivery framework that we have established that says that we can't develop Papua New Guinea in a wholesale and ad hoc fashion. We've got to have concentrated points of service delivery. And that is where you have your regional headquarters, which have regional service delivery factors like your referral hospitals. They cascade and link down to your provincial headquarters, which then go to district headquarters, local level government headquarters, and one we've introduced, which is zone headquarters, which is a cluster of 6 to 8 council wards. Okay. And then you have your ward itself. Then, of course, you have your village and your household. Some of us in the DSIP are implementing at the district level interventions at household level, at village level, and at ward council level, and up to the district headquarters. But as far as the National Service Delivery Framework is concerned, the end point is the ward council level. At each of those points, we're saying that these points should be geographically located to service a given population. And at each of those points, we should be concentrating on providing minimum services. At the ward level, there should be an elementary school. You know, there should be an aid post or a community health post, we're saying. There should be a resource centre, some form of reticulated water at where those main services are. Going up to the zone level, there should be a health centre there. There should be a primary school there that services that outlying population, and so on. We've specified that in the medium-term development plan, and we've placed that service delivery framework in the Planning Act, and then we've given responsibilities for who is meant to deliver each of those. We've then said to all the development partners, whether you're a church or you're the Australian government or you're JICA, you're an NGO, let's all concentrate on building this one map, this one development framework for Papua New Guinea. Let's not all be involved in education necessarily, all be involved in health. If you're in the space of water, we've launched the WASH policy recently, Water Sanitation and Hygiene Project recently, reinforcing this framework. All of those people in the room that are involved in water, put your hand up. This is the policy. This is the agencies you go to. If you want to be involved in district level, district development authority is there. They can own the asset and maintain it until Water PNG comes down and takes over ultimately. Water PNG sort out all the provincial headquarters, come down to district, cascade down. But there is a system and a map and a delivery framework that everyone is building together, and everyone knows what everyone else is doing. We're saying to our development partners, for example, we want 50% spent on infrastructure because that's the underlying problem at the moment. How can you deliver services to a particular service delivery centre if it doesn't have the road there? And we want the communication. So we want concentration on infrastructure, but obviously all the other elements are necessary as well. The staffing has to be there, the financial mechanisms to make sure that the funds are not abused. Create these service delivery centres, create the implementation network, and I mentioned District Development Authority. This government also is putting record funding, you see, to provincial governments and to districts and to local level governments to build that structure. There's no point in saying there's a structure and there's no money, and we'll keep all the money in Waigani. No, we are trying to put the money down there. You can have your PSTB and even your district development tennis boards, and the other elements I mentioned to capacitate at that level so that free education, the money is going straight to the school bank accounts, resourcing them to build everybody's participating in this development program. So the implementation and the national service delivery structure is an important part of the implementation part of our plans.
Minister, is there a danger of some provinces or some centres progressing faster than others?
Yes, Neville, this has been an issue historically. We know that some provinces are more advanced than others, and there are a whole range of reasons for that. Remoteness, advantage education-wise from the colonial period perhaps in terms of contact and so on. The important thing is that our monitoring system highlights these issues, and we perhaps, when we're talking to our development partners or when we're allocating funding, we give a special due attention to those provinces. But we also have to be careful because we want to reward performing provinces and areas as well. Some are just administered better politically and administratively. They need to be rewarded as well. But you can see through the budget allocation process that this government is doing things, trying to do things equally and fairly. We've tried to pool our funds and then allocate them through the SIP program, for example, in a fair manner, in a flat manner. Every district gets the same amount of funding. But we need to further refine that so that it is more based on population and actuals, and that is a difficult process. But the principle of fairness is what we're trying to promote here. And I think part of that fairness process is to identify those districts that are lesser developed because of special circumstances and provinces, and they should be accorded a bit more help. And this is where it's very important that a strong monitoring system is giving us that information in terms of health statistics and literacy information and hunger and poverty. We need to, this country is so diverse. You've got heavily populated districts which are quite small. You've got vast districts like in the Western Province with very small populations scattered. The development issues and challenges vary from district to district. It's quite complex. Telefomin is so remote up in the mountains. So this is partly why this country is so difficult to administer. Geographically difficult, population spread, so many different languages and cultures. Just coming out of still getting used to the development, the Western development way. Our land tenure system. We're difficult to free up our land because it's customarily owned, which is an excellent thing because we want our people to continue to keep their land. But how do we then make a land system that facilitates investment because you are security of tenure for the investor. And that is what the new land process does. So all these issues hinder development and makes it difficult to deliver in Papua New Guinea. And it also produces these disparities, differences in levels of development, which we need to address.
Minister Abel, for planning in Papua New Guinea and the future, has a foundation been set?
Yeah, well, I absolutely think so. I think that the principles that have been elevated in the process I've just described to you in great detail provide the foundation, absolutely. We've got to ask ourselves the question, at this stage in our development path, do we need longer term plans? Do we need to have that process? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. And I think the STARS strategy and the subsequent MTDP that expires in 2017 and the Planning Act will provide those principles and the process where successive governments can make their own custom plans but maintain the underlying principles that will keep us on the right path for the long term.
Minister Abel, thank you for your time on Tok Piksa.
Thank you so much for having me.